So I'm excited to be back here for, I think this is like the 6th week in a row. We've been talking about integrating services across the Microsoft Cloud. Specifically, we've been talking about Azure Communication Services, Microsoft Graph, Microsoft Teams, Azure, and we're going to continue that today with kind of a wrap-up talk about deployment options. So for those that don't know me, my name is Dan Wahlin. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft, and this project we've been talking about, I worked with my colleague Aicha Bosch on. And as a quick review, this is kind of what we went through, and these are all recorded. So you don't need to, I realize you can't come every single week, although you should. But if you can, this is all recorded so you can get to these. And we started off by introducing how could you embed audio video capabilities into pretty much any custom web app. And we can do that with Azure Communication Services. So we talked about how to set that up. In our case, we talked about doing it with a React app. But again, it's just a front end technology, so you could use it with Angular and other technologies out there if you wanted. Now, the last 2 weeks, Aicha joined us, and she talked about how we could use Microsoft Graph with Azure Functions to dynamically create a Teams meeting. And that would allow, for instance, a customer to go to a website, start up this audio video capability, and then call right into a Teams meeting. Pretty cool, actually. And then last week, she talked about how we could use Azure Functions to get the tokens and the identity that we need for the user that would be making this call from the custom app. Now, that's all recorded again, so if you're interested, you can go check that out. Just go to the YouTube channel for this community series. Today, I'm going to wrap it up because I think the one thing we oftentimes skip is deploying these things. You learn about all the cool technologies out there, but then at some point you have to deploy. Now, there's many options that I could choose for this. I want to kind of call that out. There's different Azure App Services. If you use containers, you could use containers. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite Azure services, though, called Azure Static Web Apps. And if you haven't used this, and you're using something like React or Angular, Svelte, Solid, Next.js version of Angular, the list goes on and on and on, Gatsby, anything that can generate static content, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, then you could use Azure Static Web Apps. And it does way more, though, than just host. And we're going to talk about that right here. Now, as a quick review, this particular app was built using React on the front end, but I want to emphasize you could choose whatever you wanted. And that's where Azure Communication Services was used. The user could go to that. That would create an event in a calendar, and then that would allow them to call into, for instance, a customer service rep, or maybe it's an employee using an app out in the field, and they need to talk one-on-one with somebody back at headquarters. Lots of use cases here. All right, so if you haven't heard of Azure Static Web Apps, this sums it up pretty well, and I'll give credit to my good friend John Papa, who's also at Microsoft. I kind of borrowed, can we say, some of these slides here that he did a great job on. So from code to global scale, when you're talking about deploying an app, and let's say it is a worldwide app, now you start to get into things like CDN and caching at the edge and all these other technologies behind the scenes to make sure that no matter where somebody hits your app from in the world, that they're going to go through the fastest route to get to that app. Well, Azure Static Web Apps can help us with that, and it takes all the complexity out. In fact, as it says here, you can build a static web app in literally minutes. I'm going to try to do that and prove that here. So if you haven't done it before, it builds and hosts static web apps. And when I say static web app, again, we're talking about a JavaScript type app as an example. So it could be HTML and just CSS. It could be HTML with JavaScript. But anything that you're using that's kind of a front-end technology would be fair game here for the most part. So that's Angular, React, Svelte, Vue, Gatsby, and you'll see other options as I go to the Azure Portal in just a moment. Now, I'm not going to have time today to go into this part, but it does support built-in authentication and authorization, so you can get that kind of out of the box. And then it also supports deploying your APIs. So it's not just about deploying the front-end app, and this particular app is calling into Azure Functions. Well, it'll also allow you, and this is optional, but I love it, it will allow you to even deploy your APIs to Azure Functions if you want. Of course, that's totally up to you. You don't have to go that route, but it is built in if you'd like to use that. And then finally, this is probably my favorite feature of all is, if you're not somebody who has to set up the build pipeline and get all that code automated, and, anytime a new merge comes in or a PR comes in that's approved, you got to get that deployed somehow. Well, for a lot of us, that's where we turn to maybe our DevOps folks over here. And you still might in this case, but it will actually generate GitHub actions for you to automate this process. And I'm going to kind of show you how that works here. Now, what this does is, let's assume you have a GitHub repo out there, public or private, either way, and a push or a PR request comes in. What'll happen is this will set up a GitHub action. It'll generate all the YAML you need, and then you could tweak it if you need to. That would automatically deploy, well, first off, build, and then deploy your content, including your functions, if you want, so that pretty much anybody across the world can now hit this. And this even takes care of different regions and all that across the world, which is super neat. So I'm going to show you this process here, kind of from scratch, or at least try to in the time I have. And then we'll kind of go from there and see how it goes. So with that, let me jump on over to a command window here. And the first thing I did, I ran this a little bit earlier just because, doing an npm install, I don't want to wait on that. But I generated a create React app. Now, if you do, something like Angular or Vue or Svelte, do your thing. Same exact process is going to apply. I'm going to stick with the type of app that was used for the previous sessions we did in these community calls. So this is a TypeScript app. I've already generated it just to show you. If I do an ls here, you'll see the standard suspects, package JSON, my source folder, all that type of stuff, and I could run it locally. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, though, is use one of my favorite tools. If you haven't installed the GitHub CLI, I highly recommend you check it out. If you go here for Windows, obviously it'll have an option for that. I'm on Mac right now. So this actually allows you to do all kinds of things. I'm only going to show you one, but you can work with PRs, issues, you can create repos, all kinds of stuff. The list goes on. In fact, if I just type GitHub repo create, now I am in my React app that was created. All right. And I'm just going to hit enter here. And now it's going to say, all right, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to create a new repository on GitHub from scratch? No, I want to push an existing local, the code I just showed you. So we'll hit enter there. What's the path? Well, I'm in the folder, so dot, leave it. Repository name, SWA demo, sure. We'll leave that. And then owner, what's your org for GitHub? In my case, Dan Wahlin. Description I'm not going to do. Visibility I want to make public. And then we'll let it do its thing here in just a moment. Do we want to add a remote so that obviously we can, check in changes and do all that? We're going to say yes. What should the remote be called? I always just default to origin. And would you like to push commits for the current branch to the origin? Yes, I would. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. And you'll notice what this does is now sets up a repo for us. Pretty cool. So if you haven't done that, that's not static web apps, but I needed a GitHub repo. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, GitHub, I want to go view the repo view, but I want to view it on the web. So I basically want to pull up a web browser. And this should now take me to my repo. There it is. There's all the code you saw that was in the folder. So, okay, we now have a repo. If you have never seen the GitHub CLI, a little bonus there for you. Now we can get to static web apps. What I'm going to do now is go to the Azure Portal. And if we come on up top here, I'm just going to type static, and you'll see static web apps comes up. And then I'm going to hit create. And from here, I'm going to let it create the resource group. We'll call this M365 demo Wahlin, make sure it's all unique. Looks good. Now you have some options here. You actually get a lot for free with static web apps. So if you haven't checked it out before, you'll notice they have a compare plans. I won't have time to go into that right now, but there's actually quite a bit you get for free. Like if you want to host a personal site, check this out for sure. So I'm going to go ahead and go with that. Now, I don't have any Azure functions in this one, but in the actual app, I do. And we'll wrap up with that in just a moment. But I'm out in the West US, so you'll notice the areas we can deploy around the world for your functions. And then it's going to say, all right, where do you want to get the source for this? Now, I mentioned earlier that GitHub is kind of the default, but if you're using Azure DevOps or even another one, you can make that work as well. I'm going to go ahead and go with GitHub. You'll notice Dan Wahlin is here. I could change the account, but that's good. And now what I can do is, all right, let's pick the org. So, well, Dan Wahlin. Now I need to go find that repository, which was SWA demo, I think it was. Yep, there it is. And then what branch? Well, I only have a main branch right now, so we're good to go. Now, this is where it gets really cool. So remember I said you could do Angular, you could do React, you could do Svelte. Well, these are the supported options, and there's even a custom because you can always do your own build process. But notice Angular, Blazor, Next.js, Nuxt, React, Svelte, Vue, just HTML. That I don't think you can beat the performance on that one. But I'm obviously going to go with React because that's what this was. And then it's going to say, all right, what is your app location? Like, where is your package JSON? Well, if we go back and I do ls, that's obviously at the root of this repo. Okay, so we're going to leave / there. Now, do you have any APIs? Now, normally what I'll do is either make a folder called API or functions like it says here, and that's where I put my Azure Functions code. In this case, I don't have it, but in the real app, which is actually right here, which I'll get to that in a moment, I do have that. So we're just going to leave it. And then the final is, what is your build location, your output location? Now, this depends. For React, it defaults to build if you use create React app. But if you use other options, there might be a different folder as the output. So you can kind of control what's the output location, because ultimately, this is where it's going to deploy the code up to static web apps and get that across the world for you. So I'm going to leave the defaults here. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to generate a workflow file for the build. This is an a GitHub action. And if you don't know about this, don't worry about it, because if you're doing the normal stuff, you just take what it gives you and it works. Now, for the custom app, which is the Azure communication ones I'm going to show you here, I did have to tweak it a bit because I had some environment variables I needed to pass in to the build process, things like that. And so, I don't live in this world either. Some of you, maybe this is your world. You do DevOps all day long. That's not me. So I did the normal. I, go check out the help docs. I go to ChatGPT. I do what I have to. So I don't have all that memorized is my point. That's not my specialty, actually. So what I'm going to do is hit review and create. We're going to leave the defaults as React. And the deployment of this is actually normally really, really fast. So we'll go ahead and hit create here, and assuming I don't have any validation errors. This part should kick off really, really quickly. We'll hope it doesn't make me a liar here, but let's see. All right, there we go. Notice, done. Yeah, but there's a little more to the story, because now if I go to the resource, notice that first off, it gave me a URL. Let me zoom that just a little bit more for everybody. That's going to be my website once it's ready. If I click it now, it's going to say, hey, I'm still waiting on your content, and I'll show you why. Because notice the source here, GitHub. Well, let's go to GitHub. And let's go to actions, and look what's going on right now. It's actually building my project as we speak. In React, I don't know, it usually takes 2-ish minutes, something like that. But I can actually drill into this. And once this gets just a little bit further, there we go. Now it's still starting to pull an image that it uses for the build. You'll see an npm install run and all the normal stuff you would do locally. It's going to do here. And again, you can control all this because this is actually in the repo. If we go back, let's go back to code. Let's go to GitHub workflows. And this file right here, which you can totally change, this is the default it generated. And again, if you don't know this stuff, don't let it scare you, because it's actually not that bad once you get the hang of it. But I'll say, I don't want to say 99% of the time, but maybe 90% of the time, it's going to give you exactly what you want. You don't even have to change anything. Now, I mentioned for me, I did have some environment variables. I had some API URLs I needed React to know about. I decided to do that through environment variables that are passed into the build process. You might use a different technique, though. You might, when the React app loads, it might call a metadata service and get those URLs. It's just what I chose to do. So the bottom line is you could totally customize not only the build of the front end app, the static app, but also what happens with your APIs. And I'll show you in a moment, you can even control what gets passed into those APIs, like environment variables. Pretty cool stuff. So let's go back and let's see where we're at here. It should be getting close to done. And I'll drill in. Yeah, so we're at like 2 minutes, 11 seconds. I told you it's 2-ish, maybe 3 minutes or so. Okay, it's done. So I was close. All right, so we're all good. In fact, if we go into here, it might be one up. You can actually get to the URL and click it. I'd have to go. Oh, there it is, right there, right there. Or I could just go back to here and click it. And prepare to be amazed, folks. The Hello World React app. That is what we've accomplished. Okay, that part's not that impressive. But what is impressive is I just literally did the whole build process, the whole deployment process across the whole world, by the way, in whatever time I just took. Pretty cool. And obviously, I didn't even have to do that much. Most of it was generated by the service. So that's the first part of this, is just what can you do with it? Well, let's move on to wrap up here with, all right, that's great, Dan, but we, over the last few weeks, have been talking about a Azure Communication Services app, and like, does that work? Because it has APIs and all this fun stuff. And the answer is yes. So I mentioned I've already deployed this one. And if I go to Overview, there's my URL for it. Okay, and this is the full app, which I'll run in just a moment. There is my GitHub repo, just like you saw. Now, yes, I have changed the YAML a bit there and tweaked that. I can get to my GitHub action runs. So I can do all kinds of fun stuff. But notice on the left here, if I go to configuration, notice I'm passing in the Azure Communication Services connection string. All right, because that is needed in this app. So that's one thing that's being passed in as an environment variable, if you will. Client ID, client secret, tenant ID, those are from my AAD app registration that I did. Because remember I said we have to set up an event so we can call into Teams. Well, there you go. That's the data there. And then user is the actual user ID of who sets up the event. So that might actually be just a system account that sets it up, and then customer service agents can join the calls. So you can customize all of that. You can set up custom domains. You certainly don't have to go with this lovely domain it gives you. In fact, I could just say add a custom domain on Azure DNS or another one. That's all built in. Here's my APIs. Now, these APIs, because remember earlier when I built this one, I didn't give it an API folder or a functions folder or something like that, right? Well, that's because I didn't have one. But this one does have that. Notice it says production function app managed. And that's because I told it, go to this folder, and that's where my functions are. Please deploy those to Azure Functions. And that includes my Microsoft Graph function that sets up the event. Now, here they are. These are the ones Aisha talked about last 2 weeks. So again, check out those recordings if you're interested. Last week, she talked about generating the ACS, the Azure Communication Services user identity and token. And then the week before that, we talked about how you use Microsoft Graph to set up the event dynamically so we can call into the meeting. So that's all being managed for me. And as I check in a new piece of code, for example, or even change a README per se, depends on how granular you want it to be, it can automatically kick off that build process and redeploy as the main branch gets changes. Pretty neat. You also have environments. So if you're used to like slots, we call them in Azure App Services, you can do similar types of things to preview environments. So if a PR comes in, it will actually generate a preview environment to try out that PR live. Super cool. You don't have to set it up. It'll do that for you just based on the PR, the pull request coming in. All right, and then I'm not going to, again, have time to go into all this, but we'd have to upgrade the plan. Right now, I am on the free hobby plan, which, again, gives you a lot of stuff. But if you want things like free, custom authentication, I should say, not free, but custom authentication, private endpoints, things like that, then you can go to the standard and you'll see the cost there. It's like $642 a month, and there could be some storage as well. Pretty cool. So does it actually work? Well, here is this version of the app. So if I go to this, it's going to say getting Teams meeting link, initializing, and this is the app you've seen for those that have joined us over the last few weeks, for the last 6 weeks. So let me pick a different camera here. I'll just go to, let me see, where is my, that's interesting. It's not showing up. Okay, we'll go to that one. That's fine. Turn that on, and this is the Azure Communication Services component. There we are. Hello. Now, from here, I could log into Teams, and I would have a Teams meeting set up. Because I've demoed that at least 6 times now, we're not going to do that again here. I'm going to leave some time for questions at the end because Vesa mentioned that. But I hope that gets everybody started with how do you get started with this Azure Static Web Apps? And, is it something that would work for some of your apps? That's up to you. It's going to work for some, and there's probably others where you're like, no, we have a deployment process we already do. We do our own thing. Great. I'd say stick with that. But this is definitely a pretty cool option. So to wrap up, and I'll put these in the chat, you can get through this tutorial, including setting up the Azure Static Web App, and all the ACS stuff we've covered over the last 6 weeks. Okay, that includes the Azure functions, the Microsoft Graph, the Teams meeting calls, all that fun stuff. You can also get to additional Microsoft Cloud samples. And when I say Microsoft Cloud here, generally what I mean is we're using 2+ Microsoft Clouds. In other words, Azure plus Microsoft 365 or Power Platform plus Azure, as an example. The Azure Static Web Apps training they have is excellent. In fact, I should have that up right here. There is an entire learning path you can go through. It covers everything you need to know. If you're doing Blazor, they even have one with WebAssembly if you're interested, which is super cool. So check that out as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and copy these in the chat. That wraps up our kind of 6-part series. So I appreciate everybody listening to us. Hope you get a chance to check it out. Vesa, I'll turn it back over to you.
Excellent, Dan. Really, really cool and great demo. I think, as I said, quite often we forget about, we show cool stuff in the tooling and VS Code and all of that stuff. Okay, how do I get this then deployed? And it's like, good point. We forgot about showing that. So thank you, Dan. Really, really cool stuff.
Thank you.
And it wasn't too difficult. It was actually quite easy to get it deployed in production. So really, really cool stuff.